Good morning, Jane Con. I'm Em Friedman, and together with my friend Emily Kugler, we are so excited to share our work in progress on Austen Games. We are very excited that because of Virtual Jane Con, we're also presenting from our new YouTube channel, which we are going to be populating after the con and in through the summer with various actual plays and videos about how we play the 18th century, both in terms of how we incorporate it into things like tabletop role playing games, as well as all of the games that we've explored with our fellow 18th century nerds, and interrogated the way that the 18th century is depicted in pop culture, here, tabletop, board, and video games. Today's talk is a version of some forthcoming published work that we're actually in the middle of revising right now. We are really looking forward in the live Q&A that will follow this on YouTube after this recording premieres to talk about some of the questions and things that you're hoping that we will explore more when we have more time than just a video recording. And we're also curious to hear what you might want to see from this channel. So hopefully this is the start of a conversation, not the end. It's also worth saying before we get started that this is a project that probably wouldn't have existed without the pandemic. Emily was the very last person outside of my immediate family that I saw before the pandemic closed us all in our own homes. And Emily and I have been meeting at least twice a week during the pandemic to play along with our friends. That, killing time and bonding exercise has really solidified our friendship and moved it from a kind of professional, appreciative colleague to a real bond. And I'm so excited that this presentation shows us working together, something that I'm hoping that we're going to be doing for a good long time to come. One of the reasons why we're doing this project in this way is because we couldn't do this alone. My current book project, which I'll be working on this summer, Before Fan Fiction, Alternative Circulation in the Age of Print, focuses on fan culture all the way back into the 18th century and thinking about the ways that outside of commercial circulation, people shared different aspects of appreciation culture. So I'm very interested in that and narrative studies and narrative strategies. And that's one part of what we're going to be talking about today. But as Dr. Kugler will now talk about, her particular research interests mesh and complement those to create something that's bigger than the sum of its parts. And now it's Emily's turn.
Thanks, Em. Hello, my name is Emily Kugler, and I am thrilled to be here today at Virtual Jane Con. This project we are working on has allowed me to spend time with a colleague I admire and a friend I adore, and it's also brought in another love of my life, which is games. I've enjoyed playing video games since my first Atari. The idea that I could take this love of games and my academic interests in the long 18th century and Regency, especially Jane Austen, was an opportunity I really couldn't pass up. It also fits into my wider research questions. My work focuses a lot on questions of identity, race, gender, sexuality, nationality, and how this fits into larger networks. In my case, this usually means the British Empire. I think fiction is really important because it shows us not just what happened in the past, but what people thought happened. And I think that the stories we tell actively shapes the futures we will live in. I've loved Jane Austen for my whole life. But as a young undergraduate thinking about going into academia, I didn't think she would fit into my professional life. I had focused a lot on late 20th century, early 21st century trans Pacific Asian women's life writing. But it wasn't until I took a class from Audrey Bilger on British feminist literature that I realized the questions I was pursuing had such a deep history. Teaching Jane Austen and British literature as a whole at Howard University, which is a historically Black college, has been a gift because I get to share what I find exciting about British literature with students, which is that the past is messy, the past is relevant, and that storytelling is an incredibly powerful art. My current work focuses on Black British women's writing and its relationship to the abolitionist movement. And I'm doing this in part because I think that representation matters. I think that it's important to realize that we have lived in a connected and diverse world for a very long time. And the games that we're going to share with you today are wonderful for a lot of reasons. But one of the things I particularly admire about many of them is how they value representation and they fight to make a space for all Jane Austen fans. With that, let's begin talking about the project itself.
While we'd been friends for many years, it wasn't really until the summer of 2019 when we were both in Edinburgh for the International Society for 18th Century Studies conference that we really discovered our deep shared love for tabletop role playing games and other games. And so when the pandemic hit, and we, like many folks, were trying to find ways to be together while apart, we began playing and recording our experiences with games inspired by or set in the 18th century. We've included our friends, experts in histories of fashion, literature, colonial history, and other aspects of the era's popular culture. We also intend on screening some of that information at the JazzNet AGM later this year. The games we have chosen rarely come from a major studio. Made by independent artists fueled by a love of Regency culture and Austen, these games are aimed at overlooked groups of gamers, including but not limited to women, and showcase their creators' technical, artistic, and literary skills. These games can be understood as part of a larger world of transformative works, which are creative works about characters or settings that are created by anyone who wasn't the creator of the original work. This is a very capacious definition that includes things like fan fiction, but is not limited to works that are non commercial. Much like Austen's Bit of Ivory, these games are small by the standards of the game industry, but are often carefully and beautifully wrought. Our goal became to better understand how these games tell us something about the reception and interpretation of the 18th century, and here Jane Austen more specifically, by modern audiences, as we're seeing it through game design and gameplay. But first, we want to provide a quick explainer of where we access these games and how you can find them as well. The largest and most popular commercial platform for games is probably Steam, which was originally started by Valve to distribute their own video games and now provides access for a variety of different publishers, large and small. Here, you can play a game that you have purchased and downloaded with your friends and family. It works on most platforms for computers and mobile devices. As you can see, a simple search for Austen does reveal a few examples, including Austen Translation, which we'll discuss in this presentation, and a few more games such as Regency Solitaire that are kind of beyond the scope of what we're going to be talking about today. Regency is a more capacious term that appears in these search results, although, of course, with more capacious results, there's a lot of false positives because, of course, the British Regency of the period that Austen lived in isn't necessarily the only Regency that has ever existed in all times and places.
Steam offers games from a wide variety of sources, including, and perhaps especially, the large AAA developers such as Nintendo, Microsoft, Sony, Sega, Rockstar, Naughty Dog, and Bethesda. By contrast, platforms like Itch.io focus on indie games. Much like independent film, these are made by a small team with a small budget. Itch.io markets itself less as a storefront like Steam for people to buy games made by a variety of developers. Instead, it is a platform for showcasing the work of independent creators. Games here cost very little. Often they are free or on a pay what you want basis. When we talk about indie games on Itch.io, we're not simply referring to small studios. These games are labors of love. And because the focus is not on profit or a large audience, there is the opportunity for greater experimentation and, we hope, more diverse representation. When searching for Jane Austen on Itch.io, we came across fewer false positives than on Steam. These were indeed games inspired by Austen, her work, and her era. They range from role-playing games such as Good Society to visual novel adaptations such as Northanger Abbey, which we will talk about later on.
For much of what follows, we're going to talk specifically about Austen games we've played and taken a look at. We're going to move from games that keep very closely to a very particular kind of notion of what Austen and the Regency looked like, and then move on to games that are trying to expand the palette and become more representative in terms of gender, sexuality, and race.
Austen Translation bills itself as a satirical strategy game. You play a young woman in want of a husband. You search for eligible suitors and compete against your rivals. In the words of the game developers, it is an Austen experience which has gone completely off the rails. It's an experience rife with dropping pianos, outrageous rumors, and mercilessly manipulated rivalries. A Jane for the digital ages, as it were. This is a game not for those who aspire to be Jane Bennet. This is a game for your Mary Crawfords and your Lucy Steeles. However, there is little explicit reference to Austen or her characters within this game. Occasionally, the game does reference Austen's works, but this is usually through puns, such as the character Henry Crawfish. It instead focuses on the social satire of the marriage market, and it presents it as a dystopic one, where you compete through your wit, your ruthlessness, and your charm.
Regency Love is a mobile game for iOS by T for 3 Studios. Interestingly, this is the only development team that has ever presented at the British Society for 18th Century Studies. They've done their homework. As the game progresses and you make different character choices, that determines the personality your heroine has, which in turn determines not only which suitor she's most likely to end up with, if any, but also how she'll feel about that ending when she achieves it, which I find fascinating. You also play various games, including Austen trivia games, in order to earn points that allow you to improve your various accomplishments. Different accomplishments mean affinity with different heroes, which also affects the gameplay, game options that are unlocked, and the shape of the ending. That said, the heroes in this game are definitely straight out of the Austen playbook, although with a twist here and there. Mr. Ashcroft, totally a Darcy dupe. Mr. Curtis, literally based on Alan Rickman. Mr. Graham, Colonel Fitzwilliam with a different kind of money issue than you might expect. And as for Mr. Digby, well, maybe we should say instead of an Austen hero, He's much more like Mr. Harris Big Wither, the man who proposed to Jane Austen, was accepted for a night, and then rejected the next morning. Poor guy. It's worth noting that, like many of the indie games that we're describing today, this is also a game that is hoping to see extension and sequels with more in app purchases for more pathways, including a kind of pivot to London for a future iteration. And so it aims later on to perhaps make extended representation into different kind of sexualities, for example. And it seems likely that those will happen since a spin off novel was successfully kickstarted and is now for sale on Amazon. There seems to be a loyal and devoted fan base for this game that seems well earned. It's going to be interesting to see how, in the kind of post Bridgerton moment, game development continues on this game.
We're excited to see what happens next with games such as Regency Love. I think it's important to pause here to note the ephemeral nature of this medium. To do so, let's look at one of the more ambitious Jane Austen game adaptations, Ever Jane. Ever Jane offered Austen fans the chance to enter a virtual Regency world. More than that, it offered a space for community building. A player did not simply go to balls or play games, they could also interact with other human players from anywhere in the world. In the words of its official webpage, Everjane is an online role-playing game set in the virtual world of Regency England and the works of Jane Austen. Unlike many multiplayer games, it is not about kill or be killed, but invite or be invited. Gossip is our weapon of choice. Instead of raids, we will have grand balls. Instead of dungeons, we will have dinner parties. Everjane falls under the category of massive multiplayer online role-playing games, or MMORPG for short. Examples of this genre that you might have heard of are World of Warcraft, EverQuest, and Second Life. Second Life is still running. Unfortunately, Everjane had to close its servers in December this past year.
Truths Untold, a game that is still currently in development, although a kind of teaser section of the game has been released for a sample playthrough, attempts to tell a story set in the Regency, although very unlike in some ways the stories that Austen told in her novels. You play Miss Fernside, who has a customizable first name but no other customizable features. She's really the heroine of a Frances Burney novel in a very real way. Um, the daughter of a French emigre whose first husband is mysteriously, is he dead? Is he alive? That's the question that the family has been attempting to answer at the start of this game. However, their investigative trip abroad has painted Miss Fernside with the accusation that she went away to conceal a pregnancy. And so at the start of the game, she comes back with a damaged reputation and is trying to navigate the new world of a neighborhood that no longer sees her as the darling of it. There's a lot we don't know about the plot of this game because the game is not yet completed. But what we do know are these are the three romantic leads. From left to right, you see the visiting sassy military man, the childhood friend who is now engaged to another woman, and the older friend of the family who has been working hard behind the scenes to retrieve Miss Fernside's reputation. It's worth noting that once again, we see a romantic option that is definitely drawn from depictions of characters played by Alan Rickman. Many players have commented on this on the game's website. There's something to be said, and maybe we'll talk about this in the Q&A, about the ways that the Alan Rickman cinematic universe kind of intersects with the Austen cinematic universe in these games. The most interesting new mechanic of this game is the way that clothing choices are used as options to develop character. So when your character, when Miss Fernside needs to go to an event, she makes an important decision about clothing. So at 3 points in the game, the player will choose for the protagonist an outfit for a key event. And it's going to communicate to the rest of those who are viewing her what her intentions are. Is she going to try to retrieve her reputation in different kinds of ways? Or is she going to dress the part of a scandalous woman? But while the game's tackling of issues like illegitimacy and premarital sex seems fresh, especially in light of other games and other Austen-inspired material, there's still not a whole lot of other kinds of representation happening in this game, at least as we have seen from the short trailer that we've got. And given that this is an indie game, seems unlikely to happen. So far, we've seen games that hew very closely to what we might think of as a typical or traditional depiction of Austen. What we're going to now turn to are games that try, through different lenses, gender, sexuality, and race, to expand the palette of Austen's world in different ways.
It is probably not surprising to anyone in this virtual room that many game developers have been inspired by and have expanded upon the representations of women and the analyses of gender roles found in Jane Austen's novels. When we refer to the games we've discussed so far as typical or traditional, we are not referring to faithfulness to a text or historical accuracy. Instead, conventional here means adhering to the assumptions many hold about the past. Perhaps the closest to a conventional adaptation of its source material, Northanger Abbey, the game, offers 3 main narrative options. You may proceed in the same manner as the original novel, in a manner of, quote, my specific choosing, and of course, there's a third option, surprise me. The first option includes the characters, major plot points, and quotations from the novel. Even in the more conventional option, the player's choices can alter Catherine's personality traits, relationships, and, as the developer puts it, in the end may find love or friendship with Henry Tilney, his sister Eleanor Tilney, or no one, end quote. There's also what the game refers to as the most dramatic choice, the nature of the society itself. The player decides whether their particular regency is a patriarchy or a matriarchy. Rather than an imagined space of gender equality, in the matriarchy option, quote, all female characters become male, and vice versa, and assigned genders are switched similarly, end quote. If the player opts to go with a narrative of their own choosing rather than adhere to the novel's structure, then they are presented with a choice of genders and gender presentations. Yet even within this pretense of choice, there are limitations. Presenting as female or male determines with whom you will dance. Only the non-binary option avoids what poet Adrian Rich termed compulsory heterosexuality. As a gentle reminder, sex is a label assigned usually by a doctor at birth based on body parts and chromosomes. This can be more complicated than male, female, X, Y, but for our purposes, the idea of assigned sex is all we need. Gender is more complex. This is about roles, expectations, behaviors, characteristics, dress, and varies by culture. Gender identity refers usually to how one feels inside and how one shows that identity to the world, or how one presents their gender. As noted before, gender is very complex and often culturally determined. For our purposes of this presentation, the games we look at often just focus on masculine, feminine, and non-binary. If you choose the non-binary option, you can also opt to have a supportive childhood. Yet upon entering Bath, you will be labeled according to a gender binary. Dancing with a gender-swapped Helen Tilney leads observers to label the non-gender conforming Kit Moreland as male. The power to shape the narrative lies in the choices you make, but how your character is perceived is already coded into the game. Further, in terms of appearance or how you are able to present your gender within the game, your decisions only determine which of three outfits you will wear: a blue muslin dress, a blue Regency suit, or a, quote, flower bedecked top hat and long androgynous coat, which is still blue. In terms of sexuality, most of the games that we've looked at focus on mixed sex and not same-sex coupling, although many developers promise that they are working on expansions or new versions which would allow for same-sex relationships.
And so, while several of the indie game designers that we've addressed so far really want to expand representation in terms of gender and sexuality, race becomes a little bit trickier. It is worth noting that most games that we have studied are text based and thus are kind of more or less beyond the scope of this particular kind of representation. However, we can say that because of that absence due to text based forms, as well as the restriction of palette in indie games, we can think about Austen games as kind of unbearably white, especially in the moment that we are in now. And justifications for this vary. If we look back to 2013 to the Everjane Kickstarter frequently asked questions, the developers say that they will offer what they call historically accurate racial diversity. Developers argue that racial diversity only becomes an issue when you get into aristocracy and, quote, ethnicities that had not yet migrated to England at that time. However, it's worth noting that because of global trade, people of color, including Black people, have existed in Britain for literally centuries by the time that Austen is living. And indeed, Everjane never made it possible for you to customize your character in any way in terms of skin tone, leading to the, quote, diversity of character representation that you see in this screenshot. That said, there are other challenges and potential pitfalls, as Haley Gordon wrote about in relationship to her team's development through Story Brewery's role playing of the tabletop role playing game Good Society. Good Society is, of course, not a video game, but a tabletop role playing game. The player gets to make and choose the characteristics of their own character. Even so, the art design for Good Society has been heavily invested in representation of people of all races and shapes, among other characteristics. The designers argue that race is almost never mentioned in Austen's novels, that ethnicity isn't important to the game, and thus they explicitly state in the game design that there will be no racism and that characters can and should be from any ethnicity. This is not far from a reading put forward by Tyrese Coleman in 2017, where she noted that race is not part of Austen's narratives because Austen's society is so definitively white. It's worth noting that this is in distinction to the game's mechanics around patriarchy. The players at the table must decide prior to the game whether they will be playing in a patriarchal society, a gender swapped matriarchal society, or an egalitarian society. There's been generative debate, although unresolved debate, between game developers about this choice. This comment to the prior piece by developer Mark Diaz Truman raises an important point, which is to say, while I'm glad I hear I can play someone who looks like me or comes from a family like my own in your game, it doesn't sound like Good Society has made room for Latino people in a meaningful sense. We're allowed to attend the party, but only if we act white, care about white things, and engage white narratives. In other words, your game might be colorful, but that doesn't make it diverse. My inclusion is dependent on my conformity. This is just one part of a much longer discussion between these two developers, which is ultimately unresolved. This debate, which took place years before our current Bridgerton moment, bring up the same kinds of questions about representation in our media. While we lament the all-white casts of games like Truths Untold and Regency Love, at least at the current moment, there's the possibility that this expansion will also increase representation, as the developers of Regency Love have noted in their London game. It still asks the question, how does representation work in a way that feels just? And so, in this last movement of our talk, we want to focus on the few games that have attempted what we're calling a broader palette to include racial diversity in their games in different forms. This is not a referendum on good and bad games, but we want to talk about the existing landscape and the challenges that face all of these games.
In Northanger Abbey, the game, race is rarely mentioned explicitly. We are looking at one of the few moments in the game where it is. Quote, "Finally we see our heroine. You are of medium height and slight build with long dark hair, and have a friendly face with East Asian features. Your sprite, like all sprites of this game, is drawn in a simple manner reminiscent of 19th century etchings." Otherwise, the race of the character is determined largely by how you, the player, see them. Does Henry Tilney's noticeably darker skin tone act as a racial signifier? What does it mean to offer a diversity of melanin but leave it unaddressed by the narrative? Race is overtly noted for the protagonist, regardless of what choices of gender, sexuality, or appearance are made, no matter whether you are playing Catherine Kit or Christopher Moreland. Your protagonist possesses, quote, East Asian features. But what does it mean to possess these features as opposed to actually being East Asian? This idea that identity is something people interpret is something we argue is a major, if implicit, theme within Northanger Abbey. Just as you interpret how you racially read the non-player characters, they in turn interpret your gender and sexuality based on your actions and dress. Beyond the choice of 3 outfits, the player chooses how they are perceived. Is their figure thin and awkward, or lithe and delicate? Their skin sallow and without color, or ethereal and golden? Their hair dark and lank, or a river of ebony? These are decisions about self-perception, shaping the character traits. Choosing the negative traits results in a humble personality perceived as lacking confidence. Positive traits lead to confidence perceived as vanity. A mix creates a balance of humility and confidence. Appropriate to an Austen-inspired piece, the narration is free, indirect, and wry. Asides are made to the nature of the gameplay and genre. This perhaps accounts for the play of the sexual and racial determinism of the game with the genre's emphasis on individual choice and perception.
The Lady's Choice very explicitly in its itch.io page describes itself as a historical visual novel that isn't going to be completely accurate. For example, as they say, there wasn't a season in Bath, although there is in the world of the game. As Serafinity, the designer, says, I wanted to have fun with this rather than freak out about every nuance of historical accuracy. You play an heiress and daughter of a viscount who has been in seclusion at your family's estate for unclear reasons. You've been out before, but you are coming back into Bath society. Your character is not customizable. This is what she looks like. While the protagonist is not really customizable beyond the name, it is worth noting that the male romantic leads, some of whom you see here, are much more diverse than other games that we've seen in this presentation. And it is worth noting that the only visibly Black character that we have yet seen in any video game appears in this game. He's a secondary character. He's a military leader. He's romantically involved with your best friend, who is also pictured on this slide, who is also slightly darker than default. Um, this isn't much to go on, but it's here. And it should be noted that the relationship between Arabella and Colonel Foxley, depending on the pathway that you select, gets a lot of screen time. So this is not something that you can control, and you can't kind of try to steal Colonel Foxley for yourself, but it is a present part of the world building. However, most characters who are darker than the average Caucasian are still rendered ambiguous in different kinds of ways, and are challenging. This is Lord Staunton, one of your romantic options, who is, you are told at first visit that he is dangerous. But the reason why he's dangerous is his father has lost all of the family's estate through gambling, and Stanton is trying to use those same mechanisms to recover his family's wealth. You can see that in the visual and textual description of the Stanton home. The fabric is rich but worn, that there are discolored patches on the walls where paintings were once hung, ornaments missing their matching partners, and the fire barely has any wood. Stanton lives with his sister, who you see here, with her son. And as you can see, they are visibly coded as lighter than their brother and uncle, uh, which is, I think, worth noting. There's a lot to unpack about this character that is kind of beyond our time limits, but we are happy to talk about in Q&A. But one of the other things that's most striking is there is a romantic lead who is a criminal vigilante. It's not Lord Stanton, and yet Lord Stanton is the one who we see visually rendered in these kinds of spectacles of violence and kind of falling into harm. This is also a game that is potentially expandable. And this character, who is a secondary friend character in the current version of the game, has been teased as possibly yet another romantic pathway. He doesn't have a pathway much yet and doesn't have a character beyond kind of snobby. So there's not a whole lot we can yet say about how this character is being depicted. It's also worth noting that this game is now 5 years old, and is done by an indie developer who, the year after, created this player character for the Crossroads, possibly taking into consideration critiques about their prior game. And this game, the character is customizable according to 3 skin tones, eye color, as well as some other characteristics. We've kept our remarks fairly short in this pre recorded, hopefully Zoom proof form so that we can have a robust live discussion. And so we do want to kind of ask some questions at the end that we hope will provoke a lively discussion. It's hard not to think of the debates surrounding the casting choices of the first season of Netflix's Bridgerton. Marketed as an inclusive romp, the series reveals the unintended layers of meaning that are added when adapting a textual media to a visual form. It is, strangely, a world where viewers are told explicitly that the British aristocracy was integrated as a byproduct of the marriage of George III to Charlotte, while the status of the slave trade is left unnoted. Mira Asaf Kafantaris details the way in which Bridgerton, quote, refuses to consider where the sugars and silks of its world come from, while still maintaining a class-based world of status and poverty. Amberine Databoy and Carrie Sinanen note the ways in which Simon's plotline, while played by Black actors, deploys the trope of the broken Black family. And of course, Patricia Matthews' early review of the series expresses hope that new character Marina will return because there's so much more to know about her story. Marina's arc into and out of the season highlights the absence of young women of color in the foreground of the series so far. Such silences and erasures, Alyssa Goldstein-Sepinwall reminds us, come from the nature of corporate studios. But it's not only corporate studios, as we've tried to argue through our depiction of what independent game designers are doing and not doing with their own racial, sexual, and gender representation in their games. Bridgerton is only the most visible Austen-inspired media creation to struggle with how to get racial representation right. As Patricia Matthew notes, I don't really know what right looks like for Black characters in an England that in 1813 had abolished the slave trade but not slavery. There are many ways to get it wrong, some disastrously and violently so.
Until very recently, attempts to transform Austen or the period have created a binary between, to use Coleman's phrase, definitively white period costume drama, or modernized multiracial adaptations, like Pride and Prejudice in 2004, From Prada to Nada in 2011, the interlocking web adaptations of Hank Green and Bernie Sue's Pemberley Digital from 2012 to 2018, and the recent miniseries Pride and Prejudice Atlanta in 2019. Based on Suzanne Elaine's novel, Refinery 29's short film Mr. Malcolm's List is now in development for a feature-length film. This costume drama uses a colorblind approach more commonly seen on stage. In colorblind casting, no attempt at realism informs the casting decisions. This is distinct from color-conscious casting, which refers to the practice of changing what is traditionally considered the race of a character as part of a production's overall interpretation of the material. We argued that these challenges of representation now playing out on film and television screens have been playing out for years in the world of video, role-playing, and board games. We offer our readings of these games as a celebration of the questions they provoke. It is hard to know precisely what getting representation right would entail, but as we see in the conversations around some of the games we describe, there are ways forward to better.